So why do people choose to use apps and platforms that make them uncomfortable about data privacy? There's lots of reasons. A cost-benefit analysis, they don't have other reasonable options, they aren't aware of the risks, or maybe they've just given up and are resigned to losing control over their data. These explanations all focus on individual level influences on privacy-related behavior. But privacy decisions take place in a social context, and social influences may also be important to consider if we want to figure out how to help people to better protect their data and their privacy. So in my previous work that I presented last year at SOUPS, I talked about how interview participants told me that they were uncomfortable with the fact that so much data is collected about them. But many of them also seemed like they were judging other people negatively who took visible steps to protect their privacy. So things like not using certain kinds of apps or technologies. And some participants even labeled those other people as paranoid or conspiracy theorists. And at that time, I speculated that this might be an indication that something social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance might be happening regarding the use of technologies that can negatively impact privacy. So what is pluralistic ignorance? It's a social norms-based phenomenon that happens when people make incorrect assumptions about other people's beliefs about a behavior. So let's say you privately believe that everybody should still be wearing masks when out in public. You attend a gathering and see that nobody's wearing a mask. You may assume that everybody would think you're weird if you decide to wear one, that they would disapprove of your wearing a mask. So you don't put yours on. But you could be making an incorrect assumption about their reasons for not wearing a mask. They might feel the same way you do and aren't wearing their masks because they think others will disapprove of them. That's pluralistic ignorance. When everybody complies with a social norm that they privately disagree with because nobody wants to violate the norm. It seems kind of silly, right? Like, if most people disagree with the norm, why do they comply anyway? And it's basically because social norms, and especially avoiding the disapproval of other people, is a very, very powerful influence on behavior. So back to privacy. What might pluralistic ignorance look like? It could look like choosing to use an app or a platform, at least in part, to avoid the disapproval of others for not using it. Like standing out as weird or deviant for not using a smartphone, or a Ring camera, or not using Uber. So the goal of this study was to find out whether the characteristics of pluralistic ignorance could be present when people make choices about whether to use technologies that could negatively impact their privacy. So there are three characteristics that have to be present to say that pluralistic ignorance is taking place. The first one is believing that using a technology is common among other people. In the literature and in this presentation, this is called an empirical expectation, so a belief that someone holds about what other people do. The second characteristic is believing that others would disapprove of you if you don't use the technology. And this is called a normative expectation, and it's a belief about what other people believe. And then the third characteristic is a person's own private belief about the use of the technology, and specifically feeling uncomfortable or disliking using it. And I conducted an online experiment to find out if these three characteristics might exist among participants. So the experiment used vignettes to present hypothetical scenarios for participants to react to. And the vignettes were short and simple, and they described using a mobile device for some purpose, requiring it to collect data and make inferences about the user. And the experiment manipulated three things. The first one was the context, so the type of usage scenario and the data and inferences that were part of that scenario. The second one was the empirical expectation, so how common it is for others to do the behavior described in the vignette. And then the third thing that was manipulated was the normative expectation, so how common it is for others to approve of the behavior described in the vignette. And then on the right side of the slide there is an example vignette, and I'm going to read it to you now. Somebody like you lives in a very similar area of the country. Most residents are using their mobile device as their wake-up alarm, which means it is possible for the system to detect how often they snooze or sleep through their alarm. Most residents also believe that it's okay for people to use their mobile device as their wake-up alarm. So this vignette presents the alarm context, and there were two others. The cookbook context presented a scenario involving using an app that can analyze the recipes a person cooks and infer how healthy they are based on the foods they eat. And the location context was about using location tracking to detect how often someone visits the bathroom. And these contexts are all based on the hypothetical scenarios that I used in my earlier interview study that I mentioned before. So there were 746 participants that completed the experiment. I used quotas for age and gender via the Qualtrics panel service that I use for recruiting. And those quotas were based on the 2019 US Census Bureau Current Population Survey. And it's really important to note that norms are specific to a group of people or a community or a culture, so we can't assume that these data would generalize outside the United States based on the sample that I used. And this was a full factorial experiment, meaning that there were 12 conditions, and it was completely between subjects, and I used random assignment to condition. So there were 3 research questions, and each research question focused on one of the 3 characteristics of pluralistic ignorance. The first research question addressed the first condition of pluralistic ignorance, the participants' own belief that the behavior, which was using the app or platform that was part of the context that they were assigned to in the experiment, is commonly done by others. And participants were asked about this before they saw the vignette. So they were just asked, basically, do you use your mobile phone as a wake-up alarm, for example? So the table on the left side of the slide shows the mean of participants' responses to 2 questions, asking them about the behaviors and beliefs of other people in their area. Participants said that over 50% of others either use their phone as an alarm or allow location tracking, and they believed that 50 to 70% of people feel that the technology use that in the context they were assigned to is acceptable. And apparently, there's a perception that nobody really uses their mobile phone as a cookbook. So I also asked participants whether they do that behavior themselves. So basically, whether they use their mobile phone as an alarm or a cookbook or allow location tracking. And the graph on the right side of the slide shows predicted probabilities from a logistic regression, basically using that question as the dependent variable. And the main thing to notice here is that in all 3 of the context conditions, when participants reported that other people around them were more likely to do and approve of the behavior, they were also more likely to report doing the behavior themselves. So basically from this, we can conclude that the first condition of pluralistic ignorance is present. So the second research question addressed the second condition of pluralistic ignorance, whether social norms increase the likelihood of doing the behavior. So after participants answered the questions about their own behavior and about the behavior and beliefs of other people around them, I showed them the vignette, so the hypothetical scenario that I talked about. And these vignettes experimentally manipulated the strength of the social norms in the scenario, which means that we can compare across conditions to find out if the strength of the norm affects participants' impressions of whether the main character in the vignette would be likely to do the behavior. And because participants were asked to imagine someone like themselves who lives in a similar area, we can assume their answers more or less reflect what they think they would do in that situation. So the graph on the right side of the slide shows the predicted values from an OLS regression, where the dependent variable was the likelihood of the character in the vignette using their mobile phones as the vignette described. And it turned out that compliance with the norm was highest across all 3 different contexts when both the empirical and the normative expectations were strong and lowest when they were weak. So in other words, the norm is causally associated with the likelihood of doing the behavior in the vignette, which means the approval of others is actually a meaningful social influence on the behavior of using the mobile phone in that way. So this means the second characteristic of pluralistic ignorance is present in the data. And finally, the third research question focused on the third condition of pluralistic ignorance, evidence that people privately dislike or don't want to do the behavior. Participants were asked how likely they thought they would be to use their mobile device in the way described in the vignette, basically after they had been told about the data collection and inferences. And the graph on the slide here shows the predicted values from another OLS regression using participants' self-report of how likely they would be to do the behavior as the dependent variable. And the main thing I want you to notice in this graph is that as the inferences became more invasive, so using a mobile phone to track oversleeping, which is a little bit less invasive, versus using location tracking to detect bathroom use, which people really didn't like in my previous interview study, participants said they'd be less likely to use their phones when the inferences were more invasive in that particular way as described in the vignette. So essentially, people's private preferences showed dislike of allowing the more invasive data collection and inferences. And this means that the third characteristic of pluralistic ignorance is also present in the data. So all three characteristics for pluralistic ignorance were present. But what does this mean for data privacy? It means that people may be choosing to use apps and platforms that compromise their privacy, even if they don't like it, because they're following a social norm. A common approach to helping people protect their data is to provide information and raise awareness. We've heard a lot about that in this conference. Information about risks, about data practices, and even social information about what apps the people they know are and aren't using, and how they configure their privacy settings. But if pluralistic ignorance is occurring, information about risks is irrelevant for people who already dislike the behavior and are uncomfortable about the data collection. They're already uncomfortable and they're doing it anyway. And telling people about what others are doing only reinforces the norm if the others are complying with the norm. So what can we do about this? Unfortunately, I don't have a magic design solution for this problem. Social influence is really complicated, and it's hard to counteract when it happens basically before people even start to use an app or a platform. We can't have a design solution that impacts them if they're not even using it yet. And sometimes it really feels like if people only knew what the platforms that they use were doing and what the data they collect, they would stop using these platforms. But norms and pluralistic ignorance especially create this social pressure that it makes it a lot harder for people to just stop. So research on pluralistic ignorance in other areas for sort of non-privacy related behaviors has found that providing information about others' true beliefs rather than information about risks or sort of educational awareness interventions can help people feel less isolated, which maybe will help them be more comfortable violating the social norm if they feel like they're not alone. So the real takeaway from this project is the importance of social norms and how we shouldn't ignore social influences when trying to understand why people say they care about privacy and then don't act like it. And if you're interested, replication materials for the project, including the survey instrument, the data, and the analysis code, are all available on the OSF website at the link in the slides. Thank you.